these programs didn't come about because all of a sudden, the administrators at various public universities and private universities came to the conclusion that they could improve everybody's education by having a few black people and a few brown people on the campuses. But in fact, that these programs were created out of the movement of the civil rights movement to the North, and Black and Latino students standing up and fighting and demanding that places like the University of Illinois and every single one of the states, graduate school programs, law schools, medical schools, start accepting Black, Latino, Native American, and other minority students. That's what transformed these universities into being places that were once white job trusts into places in which there was some modicum of integration and hope and possibility for minority students.
I have a dream.
Abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." In the 1950s and 60s, the demand for social justice and equality had America at the breaking point. People of color were on the brink of revolution, and access to higher education was a part of that struggle. A very select few African Americans and Latinos were able to access higher education in the years leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. Regardless of how they got to university campuses, students of color found a less than hospitable environment once they were there.
The small numbers of students was something that hit you over the head. Culturally, it was very different.
James Anderson is a renowned historian on the subject of underserved minorities in higher education. Now a professor at the University of Illinois, he was one of only a handful of black students when he attended graduate school there in 1966.
You'd grown up in institutions that were built around your culture, and they were, from your perspective, your institution, your team, the school spirit, the clubs, the student government. It was all something that belonged to you. And now you move into an environment where you're not even represented in these areas, and you're not expected to be represented. And it's very difficult for you to participate in those facets of the university. So you're going from a place where you feel that you really belong into an environment where you feel terribly alienated. And so that was the experience coming in there. In fact, the big challenge that I had was not to leave at the end of the first year.
We had a whole series of other issues going that fuel the discontent. We didn't see ourselves in the institutions, not in the police department, not in the public schools, not in the welfare department, not in any of them. That was part of the perception that the institutions and the power structure was just about keeping us out.
Northwestern was a reflection of the larger society. You had policies in place that were exclusionary, that were discriminatory, that were not embracing. And these students coming in found themselves having to either go along with it or challenge it.
In 1968, Wayne Watson, a champion wrestler, was one of 90 African American students who took over the bursar's office at Northwestern University. Their demand? Better living conditions and more access for people of color.
I had the option not to become involved because I was an athlete. And as an athlete, I had a protective cover over me. And I could have easily walked around the issue that the 90 African American students at Northwestern found and taken a very safe and very comfortable path of being one of the star athletes at the university. I chose not to.
I would simply like to say that I think this has been one of the great days of America. And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
Those days, if you recall the time, the Vietnam War, the Kennedy assassinations, King's assassination, it was a very volatile period. And these students were extremely political. And because they were political, they didn't take much. They were not interested in accommodation at all. So we had lots of crises, lots of racial interactions that were inappropriate, lots of hostility, lots of anger, lots of some violence, because we came there at the same time when the Vietnam War protests were going on, the Chicago riots, all those things were happening.
Puerto Rican riots of '66 forced, in this case, the city to begin with, to change its approach to the Latino community, in this case, the Puerto Rican community.
Latino protests erupted in Chicago and other major cities. In 1968, Latino students in several East Los Angeles high schools began staging what they called blowouts, walkouts protesting inadequacies in funding and programs, and the poor physical conditions of their schools. The blowouts soon spread across the country as the new Chicano movement took hold. During one blowout in Chicago, students took over their crumbling school and demanded a new one. The protest helped lead to the eventual building of the Benito Juarez High School that the community was demanding. The Chicano and Black Power movements were now political forces that could not be ignored.
In Illinois, black students took over the campus at University of Illinois. Black students took over the campus at Northern. Black students took over the campuses at Eastern and Western. As soon as their numbers got more than 2, they let it be known that, hey, we're here to be dealt with, and we want some more just like us, you know. And everybody had to develop a recruiting component. They started a movement that shook the educational system, higher education, to the core. And the desire to bring black faculty to white institutions came about because black students demanded, commanded, got it done. Unrelenting, not accepting no for an answer.
Their motto of the Black Student Association was, "We demand everything, we expect nothing." And that was their mantra, and they lived it.
I don't think the country would be what it is today if the students of the 60s had not challenged the fabric of the universities in terms of opening their policies, opening their mission standards. The universities would not be what they are today.
But to many Latinos during that time, graduating from high school was the biggest thing in the world. If you graduated from high school, wow, you were something.
Like most minorities, Miguel Del Valle grew up in an environment where higher education seemed out of reach. While their white classmates headed for colleges and universities, people of color were pushed toward vocational schools, factories, and the military.
I graduated from a Chicago public high school, and while I had some folks, and one in particular, who advised me to go on to higher education, it wasn't exactly a priority. I remember that the day that I was going to go visit a military recruiter, because I thought I wasn't going to be able to get into school and I wanted to find something. The very same day that I was going with some of my buddies to go see a military recruiter and talk about maybe enlisting in the Navy, I received the letter from Northeastern saying that I had been accepted. And I was surprised. I said, wow, I got in through regular admissions.
Del Valle went on to become the first Latino elected to the Illinois State Senate, where he became the only non-black member of the Illinois Black Caucus. In California, the Latino or Chicano student movement was taking hold. A 155-page manifesto called the Plan de Santa Barbara outlined proposals for the implementation of Chicano studies educational programs. The plan, which also called for community activism, along with Latino political leadership and independence, would lay the foundation for what would become a national movement. On that front and many others, the common agenda for people of color was taking shape.
At the time, Champaign and Urbana had a very, very active civil rights leadership within the African American communities. They were on campus and a part of campus. They were connected to students. They also were in negotiation with campus leadership, but they wanted to increase the number of African American students from Champaign and Urbana that could get admitted to the university. I don't think any element was more critical than they were, because they were in the meetings, they were challenging the university to make a change, they were negotiating with the chancellor and other administrators in the university. They supported the students in all of their efforts to bring about those changes.
Community efforts such as those in Champaign and Urbana were taking place all over the state, and they led to several colleges and universities starting programs and hiring people, often those very same community activists, to attract more students of color. Trailblazers like Jim Griggs at the University of Illinois at Chicago, William Doc Speller at Northeastern Illinois University, Seymour Bryson at Southern Illinois in Carbondale, political activist Rudy Lozano, UIC professor Otto Picasa, and Oscar Lopez Rivera, now a political prisoner, but then a community activist, were capitalizing on the energy of the civil rights movement to open up more opportunities for Black and Latino students to enroll like never before. In Chicago, community activists without a specific college affiliation, like the legendary Silas Purnell, also took up the fight. Purnell, a former Tuskegee Airman, gave up his successful marketing career to help disadvantaged African American students get into college. Through placement programs like the federally funded Talent Search, he helped an estimated 60,000 Black students get into colleges and universities across the country.
Our kids, especially poor kids in the state of Illinois, were not getting good information. They wasn't getting enough of it.
Silas Purnell was our voice. He would say anything, anywhere, to anybody about Black kids. And so when we wanted somebody to really get ugly and not be professional, we'd send Silas. But Silas put more kids in schools all over the country, and they did well because Silas would always take care of them. He was just a legend. You know, the street where his office is named after him, but it doesn't tell the story nearly as well because Silas was in the projects. You would have to go around, outside, and then down into the basement through puddles of water to get to Silas's office. But if you told the gangs that were standing outside, I'm going to see Mr. Purnell, they'd say, oh, we'll take you. They wouldn't snatch your purse. Silas would not move from that place. And all kinds of parents made their way around that little nasty place to get to see Silas Purnell because they knew if they got there, their children were going to be sent to college and they were going to succeed.
Purnell also co-founded the Illinois Council for College Attendance, or ICCA, in 1968, an organization that works to support access and retention of underrepresented students in higher education.
And we were showing and have shown that you could take people who score very low on the ACT, but who had something else that people didn't understand. That was a high ambition quotient, not IQ, but AQ. And sometimes that counted more than IQ, was, what was the guy's ambition? And that was what we wanted to capitalize on, was not so much, where did you test, but where do you want to go?
The 60s and early 70s were a time where there was so much effervescence. We were also trying to find out how to best get what we wanted using different tactics. Okay? And at times forming alliances with, again, with African American students, with other Puerto Rican students, other Latino students. The relationship we had with some of the gang members, we both lived in the community. Both groups made up of gangs and student organizations, both made up of young people, of course. They both come from the community.
There was a relationship between African American street gangs and student organizations. Many of us were gang members from high school, to be frank with you, or either very active in the Black Panther parties. And so those experiences followed us to college. And I think that we recognized that it was important to develop coalitions, if you will, with the organizations from the community, and we brought those experiences to campus, and we worked collectively to continue the good old fight of keeping the doors of opportunity open.
The leader of the African American community's movement was Martin Luther King, and for us it was Cesar Chavez.
Cesar Chavez, a Mexican-American labor leader and civil rights activist, was the leading voice for Latino migrant workers and other minority poor. His fight inspired Chicago's Latino community, where previously passive endurance of the status quo also gave way to protest.
Still, my English not is perfect, but my spirit was in the idea.
Maria Demesqua, head of the organization Parents for Fair Treatment at UIC, urged Latino residents to attend a protest rally at Chicago's Roberto Clemente High School. The campaign targeted UIC over its plan not to accept credit for English as a second language. This policy would have prevented scores of Latinos from being accepted to the university.
So I keep fighting and telling them, please be there. If you are interested in your kids' career, I don't want them to be always the gardeners, the waiters, which not anything wrong with that. But the fact of the matter, I want them to graduate and to have a profession. That night in Clemente, I am very proud to say I am being told we have 1,400 people or more. And the chanting was, UIC, open your doors.
Community pressure did eventually force UIC to open its doors. The protest also united parents with Latino professionals in the struggle for access and equity. From that bond, the Community Advisory Committee on Higher Education, also known as CACHE, was born. CACHE would later lay the foundation for the formation of IALHEA, the Illinois Latino Council on Higher Education, which broadened the Latino battle for equity and access into a statewide movement.
I felt that it was important to create a vehicle that would bring the few Latinos who were working in higher ed. It was important to bring them together and have them communicate more and have them develop an agenda that would facilitate the advocacy necessary to increase Latino recruitment rates in our public universities in the state of Illinois, and of course to increase retention and graduation rates as well.
At Northern Illinois University, Roberto Rivera took on the administration in his role as the first coordinator for the Center of Latino and Latin American Affairs.
The Latino kids that I was working with really was the foundation, the leadership foundation from the community. Given, the dropout rate, given the loss of life and, the gang stuff in the community and all of that, these kids were really on top of a bubble. Yet the university was unresponsive to their needs. And so as this thing, mushroomed, I was almost escorted off campus. I mean, they claimed that I was propagandizing against the university. And so I remember in my exit interview that I would be back. And I meant it. I was going to be back.
Rivera would return to NIU, this time as Chief of Staff for Illinois State Senator Miguel Del Valle, as politicians began shining a harsh light on the policies that had kept so many from entering the doors to higher education. Members of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, including its one Latino member, Del Valle, followed the lead of then Senate Education Subcommittee Chairman Richard Newhouse in holding colleges and universities across the state accountable for their enrollment practices.
Our first hearings were at Northern Illinois University. And so therefore I came back, but I didn't, I came back with the General Assembly.
It was a joint House-Senate task force that conducted hearings throughout the state. And we were able to, through those hearings, get lots of attention on enrollment rates at our public universities. And we were able to get the faculty to testify, support staff to testify. We were able to bring university presidents to the table and force them to have to answer tough questions. I don't think anything like that had ever been done before.
The movement for minorities in higher education, it stops and starts with Dick Newhouse. Dick's presence, in a way, his influence undermined how important it is to have political. A lot of what goes on in higher education is political. And without political involvement or leadership, I don't think very much is going to happen, because he made higher education a priority.
In Washington, political pressure for educational justice was mounting. Federal programs aimed at increasing the number of minorities in colleges and universities began taking shape. Clark Chipman, just back from serving his country in the Vietnam War, was asked to serve in a different capacity upon his return. Chipman played a lead role in establishing academic support programs for minority students across the Midwest, programs that became known as TRIO.
The War on Poverty really created a lot of initiatives in varying departments in government, and the response to poverty and the need for opening up higher education was the U.S. Office of Education's response. So it was part of Kennedy's dream and Lyndon Johnson's implementation. Our job really was to go to high schools all over the 6 states and colleges, meetings wherever we could find them, to tell guidance counselors, principals, teachers, parents about the existence of this new set of federal programs called student financial aid.
State money began flowing too. The Higher Education Cooperation Act, called HECA, created grants for the establishment of educational programs and services for minorities. Jake Jennings was in charge of HECA grants.
Jake, I think, was over a lot of funds for a lot of special programs in the state of Illinois. I remember after the meeting, we went to this hotel just to relax. And for the first hour and a half, there was, the people from higher education institution, Illinois, University of Illinois, Eastern, Northern, and then I left and went back to my room. And when I came back, Jake had a different audience. He had a lot of people with leather jackets and motorcycles, and it was just that kind of shift, but it showed the kind of presence and role that he played in the state. I think any minority group that wanted funding from the state had to come through Jake.
Little by little, increasing numbers of minorities on campuses led to changes in classrooms and curricula.
The thinking behind the rationale for African American studies had to do with wanting our students to feel more welcome in the environment. They wanted to find some way to reflect their experiences, their lived experiences, in an environment which was extremely hostile. It also was an attempt to make them feel more secure within themselves. It was essential for these young people to feel important, to feel vindicated, to feel they in fact had a place in this environment.
The doors to that place had been forced open, thanks in part to so many who never had the opportunity to walk through them.
We wanted everyone to understand that we were not at the university on our own merits, that we were at the university as a result of the effort of the whole community. Don't try to find a job that is going to be easy, but go back where you're needed. And we always emphasize the fact that once you were able to go through the higher education process, that you were a role model, for the rest of the students, and that the students needed to see themselves in the people that were graduating at the time.
We still don't have enough Latinos and African Americans graduating with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees in computer science. We still don't have enough Latino and African American math teachers, science teachers. We don't have enough RNs. We don't have enough professionals in a number of areas that will continue to grow as our economy grows. And so there's still a tremendous challenge here.
Despite the significant gains of the 1960s and 70s, the number of minority students, faculty, and staff is on a downward trend at many of Illinois' institutions of higher learning.
There were several important Black organizations that played the role of as they used to call ICBCHE, Itchy Bitchy. We played the role of prodding people to do things that they should have been doing without the prodding.
ICBCHE, the Illinois Committee for Black Concerns in Higher Education, was formed in 1982. ICBCHE, along with its Latino counterpart, IALHEA, the Illinois Latino Council on Higher Education, worked to reverse that downward trend.
When Latinos and African Americans come together, and we can claim victory together on an issue, and those victories are few and far in between. But when they happen, they have a way of just reverberating and being felt throughout the community and throughout the state.
There was a understanding that if there was an organized effort that we could be successful in advocating for increased number of African American faculty and staff and Latin American faculty and staff. And so the organizations were the Illinois Committee for Black Concerns in Higher Education, the Illinois Council for College Attendance, the Illinois Latino Council, and as well as the PLATI, which was the Latino Admissions Group, formed this organization that was called the New Majority Coalition. And everyone made a commitment to continue to work to advocate, because at that time we were beginning to see these conservative forces. We saw what was going on in California and Texas, where there were individuals from the conservative right that were working to undo some of the gains that were done in the 60s. That led up to our continuing to work together to apply for a grant from the Illinois Board of Higher Education to form a new initiative that was really patterned after the New Majority Coalition, the Illinois African American Latino Higher Education Alliance.
The Illinois African American and Latino Higher Education Alliance, also known as IALHEA, is working to preserve the history of the struggle for higher education, even as that struggle continues.
This is your movement. You are the new leaders of this nation. When we're talking about affirmative action programs, we're talking about trying to combat institutional racism, the ways in which race still structure opportunities in this society. And when you're fighting against institutional racism, which is not just something of the past, but which expresses itself in the use of standardized tests in admissions process, tests which everybody knows are biased and discriminate against the opportunities of minorities in this country, then you're talking about the creation of programs that are really to combat inequality in educational access and opportunity. And that goes beyond a question of just trying to create a diverse student body.
I think that everyone in minority higher education, particularly Latino higher education, we still face today attempts to eradicate what many have fought for. And though eventually we're not going to need these type of programs one day, we're not there yet. We still don't have parity. There was a study that says at the current rate compared to our population, it's going to take 100 years for us to have parity. Well, we don't have 100 years. We're not going to wait for 100 years. That's why a number of us are little by little at all corners pushing the button to make sure that that representation, that 100 years is reduced down to 50, 40, 20.
Integration is a must. We want that.
There is a challenge for a new generation, not to forget the lessons of the past.
Now we're getting more and more students who are the sons and daughters of college graduates. Students who come there because they were prepared to come to the campus, who expected to. Those students we worked with before had no such expectation. Hence their mantra, we expect nothing, we demand everything. Today's students, I often, when I get my fatigue sets in, I always say things like, today's students say, we expect everything, we demand nothing.
We gave up. We came to think that there was a way that we could win equality without building a movement and having young Black and brown people standing up and saying, we won't accept being treated as inferior. We won't accept second-class citizenship. That's what it took to win these programs. That's what it's going to take to maintain these programs.
Shanta Driver is one of many building that new movement. Driver is the executive director and national spokesperson for By Any Means Necessary, or BAM, a Detroit-based agency that provides legal counsel and community organizing support for those opposing recent attacks on affirmative action programs in higher education.
We went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2003 on April 1st when the Supreme Court heard the two University of Michigan cases. We were able to mobilize 50,000 young people of all races, some of whom never have even dreamed of being able to go to college, to be a part of that demonstration to defend affirmative action because they understood that that fight was the fight for equality, the fight to preserve the hope and promise of Brown versus Board of Education, and they turned out. And we saw that as being the beginnings of a new civil rights movement.
Legal challenges and ballot propositions like the ones Driver and her colleagues opposed in Michigan persist to this day. The hard-won programs that promote and assure access for all people in Illinois and across the nation continue to come under fire. Clearly, the struggle is not yet over. Clearly, students, educators, and all people must continue the call for access and equity in higher education for everyone.
Don't assume that what's in place is inevitable and permanent, that there's always an ebb and flow to history, that you may have an opportunity through affirmative action today, you may have an African American Culture Center today, or you may have this today, but there is no guarantee that it will be there tomorrow except through eternal vigilance on your part. That these are things you have to continue to fight for.
important that we leave here with the understanding that black and brown youth, and really all youth, but particularly black and brown youth, share the same culture. All right, you're not separate.
We have to recognize that this work has been done for centuries and recognize our ancestors that have also been fighting for us to be to have a better tomorrow.
As we talk about being one, we talk about being well, we talk about being healthy. So within ourselves, we have to find love, we have to find tolerance, we have to find peace within ourselves as individuals.
If we get together and understand the purpose and the mission, and then apply the skills that we have inherently, and that's what hopefully we'll learn today, we can get there. Education is a huge part of it.
We want to get you in the spot, we want to keep you in the spot, and we want to graduate you.